Okay, let's see. We're going to talk next to Matthew from New Jersey. Matthew, welcome.
Hey, Steve. Thanks for taking the call. Steve, I have a question that I'm sure you probably answered a few hundred times, so I hope you don't mind or can summon the enthusiasm to answer again. About the idea or facts that God is both just and sees all sin as equal. I have a kind of like a fundamental issue with wrapping my head around that someone who lies to make a living or just like kind of a harmless liar and maybe a murderer, are kind of on the same plane as far as sin.
Mm-hmm. I have trouble with those things too because I don't believe both of them are scriptural statements. It's sort of like, it's hard to harmonize these two statements. God ordains everything that happens, and people are responsible for what they do. Now, one of those statements is biblical, and the other is not. If they were both in the Bible, we'd have a problem. Because if God does ordain everything that happens, then that means he ordains, apparently by his will, not human will, what human beings will do. And that would mean humans would not be responsible. And Calvinists try to affirm both of those things because they say that God ordains all that happens, but that people are responsible anyway. But it just doesn't make sense. And it's the same thing. It doesn't make sense to say all sin is equal and is punished equally, and that God is just. Because, how could that be? Obviously, some people sin very accidentally. Some sins are so subtle that you don't even see it coming, and you've committed it before you knew. You recognize only afterwards. Other things are like premeditated. Every legal system that has any semblance of justice makes a difference between somebody who accidentally kills somebody and through negligence, and somebody who maliciously kills somebody. Even the Old Testament law, which is said to be perfectly just, makes a difference there. The person who maliciously kills somebody has got to be put to death. That's a pretty severe sin, a pretty severe penalty. But a person who accidentally kills somebody could go to the city of refuge and could escape the penalty of death. Why? Why make a difference? Because one is worse than the other. That's why one is more heinous than the other. The Bible nowhere says that all sins are equal. And we see, for example, in the law of Moses, which identifies many sins for the first time in Scripture, that there are different penalties for different sins. If you steal something, you have to pay it back with interest. If you commit adultery, you're put to death. If you sleep with a woman who's not somebody else's wife, you don't have to be put to death, but you do have to marry her. There's different recourse for different things that you do wrong, because some of them are more heinous than others. They're not all equal. And if they were, then the law wouldn't be just. And the Bible insists that the law of the Lord is just, that there's no injustice in his laws, which means that when you see differences of penalties for different acts, it means there's different degrees of guilt and culpability assumed about them. So I agree with you. It would be strange to try to say all sin is really equal inside God, and yet he's just, because that would mean that a person who commits any sin, even somewhat accidentally or that hurts nobody or whatever, is going to get exactly the same punishment as someone who's Adolf Hitler, Now, the Bible, Jesus said about people who don't do God's will, he said that servant who knew his master's will and did not do it will be beaten with many stripes. But he said that servant who did not know his master's will and did things worthy of stripes will be beaten with few stripes. Now, both of these people have done things that are worthy of punishment, but they get different punishments because one knew better and one didn't. And so, obviously, the sins that are calculated and deliberate have a heavier penalty than those that are accidental or ignorant or something like that. So I'm gonna just challenge that whole idea that all sins are equal.
Thank you, Steve. Then where does the idea of all sin being equal in God's eyes come from?
I think it may come from a statement like in James when it says, the law says don't murder and don't commit adultery. If you don't commit adultery, but if you murder, you've sinned it. He that breaks one commandment has broken them all. But he explains what he means by that is all of them are equally sins against God. They're not equally heinous sins against God. But if you break one commandment and keep others, you've still broken God's law. You've basically sinned against God. And in that respect, all sins equally are sins against God. You can't just say, well, I keep most of the law, but I only break these few laws, so it's cool. No, you're disobeying God by breaking a few laws, just like, or one law, as if you broke the whole thing. But that doesn't mean that, the culpability and the repayment and punishment and stuff like that is equal for every kind of law. It's more figurative. It's not saying that if you literally have committed one sin, you've committed every sin in the book, because that just isn't true. But what he says is, if you commit one sin, that's a sin against God. And every other sin is a sin against God. In that respect, you aren't innocent, even if you keep most of the law, but break any of the commands of God. You are still guilty. And I think that what evangelicals have done is try to make it very clear that we all need salvation, even people who think they're relatively righteous. The way of the master ministry, they like to emphasize the use of the Ten Commandments when you're witnessing to someone who says, well, I think I'm okay. I'm not really guilty of anything. I'll go to heaven. Like Ray Comfort will say, well, let's look at God's law. You should not kill. Have you killed? Well, maybe not. But Jesus said, if you are angry at your brother without cause, you're guilty. Have you done that? Obviously, most people have. He said, how about you should not commit adultery? Maybe you haven't committed adultery. Maybe you have. But Jesus said, if you do it in your heart, you're guilty too. And so, the idea is to let people know that even if they seem relatively decent, that somewhere along the line, they have fallen short of the glory of God and they've sinned. In that sense, one could say all sins equally condemn a person, but they don't necessarily condemn them all to equal fates. Again, there's the matter of a few stripes and many stripes. The punishment, if you do things worthy of stripes, you get stripes. But whether you get a lot of stripes or a few depends on various circumstances of the case.
Yeah, fantastic. Understood. Thank you so much, Steve.
All right, Matthew. Good talking to you. God bless you. Thanks for calling.